Namaste. And Vanakkam. Can I borrow your stopwatch now? I lost mine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, honoured friends, and even more honoured strangers. I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, I'm going to be discussing privatisation more generally, because we think that Team America has somewhat over-exaggerated the benefits of privatisation relative to the potential cost to an economy. Second, I'm going to talk about economic strategy and why we think a state involvement in an economy is rather important for being able to manage your economy, because once you give it to the private sector, it's generally very difficult to get it back. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about social justice, which, as John pointed out, is the dimension which is largely missing from Harvard's case. What Harvard's case is saying, well, look, we're going to get more money in the economy. More money means more jobs means less poverty. This is naive, ladies and gentlemen. It is naive for many reasons, and we're going to be discussing them today. So, first, we say that the trouble with privatization, and you see this both in the developed world and the developing world, is that once you privatize something, it's very hard to renationalize it. That is problematic at the point where once you effectively give sovereignty over those parts of your economy, whether they are strategic or whether they're important for service provision to the most vulnerable people in your society, you then no longer have control over them, and it's very hard to wrest control from those private interests. We say that's problematic at the point where the state has things that it wants to achieve. It has duties that it owes to its people, and when it cannot fulfill those duties, and when it cannot achieve those strategic interests, that means its ability to function as a state is rather problematized. We say that Harvard's case amounts to this. They say, well, you really need more investment in infrastructure and energy. We say, at the point where they're advocating free market policies, this is absurd. If you want more investment in your infrastructure, invest more in your infrastructure. There are many states that do this, right? State capitalism in China is perfectly functional. It is not enough for them to turn around and say, look, India suffers from cronyism. India does suffer from cronyism. Cronyism is getting better in India. It's not getting worse. We're having a situation in which we're having to evolve from the license Raj of the pre-1980s era. India is evolving. The question is whether we want it to evolve into effectively what they do, a country in which it functions primarily as a low-level service economy servicing the developed world, or alternatively, basic primary industry production. We don't think that's in India's long-term strategic interest, when the alternative we give you is a state which is actively involved in promoting its economy, something we're willing to accept in America, because America is not a free market economy either. They massively invest in their economy indirectly through tax subsidies to their major corporations. Or countries like France, where through dirigism, they actively and openly invest in companies like Citroën in order to achieve their strategic interests. No, thank you. So, I said, well, the trouble is, the state can't run all these companies themselves. Well, we ask why not. I mean, it's not as if it's a random member of the Lok Sabha who runs the state-owned enterprises. They hire managers. Why is the state so incapable of hiring managers, but the private sector is able to do it instead? We say the difference is the managers that the state hires will be invested in trying to achieve the state's ends. That's important because those private managers that they offer have perverse incentives to do things that are not in the state's interest. The reason, Harvard, that you have currency controls in India is not just to screw you over. The reason they have it is in order to prevent private investors repatriating all the profits back to their home countries. We think this is important because we think that at the point where those people have invested money in India, it is useful if that money stays in India. It is not useful to India if that money goes back home to America or to whatever tax haven that company has decided to base itself in, hypothetically. Like, we say that fundamentally when you see companies like Japanese companies, like American companies, investing in countries, they usually have CEOs based in their home countries. They usually have political incentives, if they have any incentives, to adhere not to the government of the country they are now based in, but to the government of their home country, because that is the government that will bail them out if things goes wrong. That is the government that will offer them tax breaks for their HQs, for their senior CEOs. That means you have a situation in which you have literally given sovereignty over key strategic parts of your economy to companies who are, if they are ruled by any public interest at all, are ruled by the public interest of another state, not your own. That is unlikely to be in your strategic interest. We say that the examples they gave you are absurd. They say, well, look, you know, land reform is very important in India because people need to securitize their assets. You know, maybe they live in a slum, maybe they live in a very, you know, shanty town. It's very useful if they're able to use, you know, that shack in order to securitize a loan. We say no. We say it's perfectly possible to engage in social entrepreneurship, in order to enable the low-level consumers of a country in order to engage in the private sector. But we say you do that through things like the Grameen Bank, you do that through micro-lending, right? It's perfectly possible for the state to be actively involved in that process and provide them the seed capital to do that. They don't do it by acting as real estate agents. This is not Kansas, this is India. We say no. We say they assume for some reason that the only people that can create jobs are the private sector. We say no, it is perfectly possible for the public sector to do jobs. Like, I'm not advocating necessarily supporting the BJP, right? But the reason that Gujarat has such high growth is not because it is a privatized state. It is entirely the opposite, which is why the BJP advocates returning to a more protectionist system when it enters into government. Why didn't they Google India before coming here? We say that fundamentally we have a situation in which when you look at companies like Citroën in France or like Tata Steel in India, you have a company which has grown over the past 10 years to one of billions of dollars of worth by means of using things like carefully structured import tariffs and state subsidies in order to facilitate that growth. The situation they advocate is the opposite. You remove those import tariffs, you remove the ability of the state to be able to strategically invest in its own development, and therefore you lose the ability of the state to promote its own economic strategic interests. Closing.
On our side of the house, we also get competition for domestic businesses and domestic entrepreneurship because we've removed cronyism and corruption. You don't.
No, like, this debate is not about cronyism, right? This is a debate about whether or not you should massively privatize the Indian economy and whether you should facilitate people from other countries coming into your economy and investing in it. We say they're not investing in it, they're literally buying up chunks of your country, and once they do, you can't get it back. It is very important for India, the point where the alternative conception of India is one of a genuine world power. We see there's a state capitalist country literally on the borders of India. We see that it is highly successful. The question is, does India want to seize its own destiny and potentially become a country like that? A country able to literally take the world in its hands as a major superpower? Or does it want to be an adjunct to the American state because all of its key strategic sectors in its economy are owned by American companies, paying American taxes and serving American public interests? We say India should do the former. As far as social justice and stability goes, note that when the state owns key sectors of the economy, it can promote social justice in a way that private companies are very unlikely to do. Why is labour law in Tamil Nadu so important? Because, like, the way in which you have affirmative action for Dalits and other scheduled castes is by the public sector. If you privatize all the public sector, you lose the ability to promote things like the interests of Dalits. We say that India needs more poverty reduction strategies. It needs more investment in things like rice subsidies for the poorest people. It needs to do more to alleviate poverty. It does not need the unmanaged growth of its economy. When doing so, will obviously create social instability. We are very, very proud to oppose.